Hello, hope you are doing really well and thriving and practicing radical self-care. So just some suggestions to when you start your day, wake up with a morning meditation. If you want, I can send you a link to some meditations for PTSD and trauma. I would wake up with that in the morning, or wake up with a positive guided meditation. Instead of looking at Facebook or Instagram or any sites on narcissism, I definitely recommend that you do some self-care, which is like a 10-minute meditation when you wake up, and then maybe some prayer. I begin my morning with some prayer and meditation, and I spend a little bit of time with my higher power. So whatever you do to sort of get grounded and to start your day with this positive intention. And then also, I highly recommend doing some morning mantras, some positive affirmations to start your day. And then, of course, exercise, 8 glasses of water, getting in touch with the spiritual community. You could do a 12-step recovery for codependents or adult children of alcoholics, ACOA, or, a narcissistic abuse support group. Also, I highly recommend getting a trauma therapist, one who understands attachment issues, abandonment issues, personality disorders, toxic relationships, and get a narcissistic abuse coach or a life coach or a codependent coach to help you to learn how to set better boundaries, how to avoid these sorts of relationships, how to heal some of that childhood or be aware of some of that childhood abandonment trauma and do some work around that. If you're interested in private coaching, go to www.coachcat.org. In this video, what I'm going to talk about today is some potential barriers or difficulties that might be between you and being able to set really clear, healthy boundaries. These are some of the things that may be prohibiting or making it difficult for you to set healthy boundaries. One would be low self-esteem. So the more that you learn to love and care for yourself, the less likely that you will be to allow others to mistreat you. The more you learn to have a lot of genuine respect for yourself, then you will be much better about being clear on what your limits are for the behaviors that you will allow in your life and how you, what you will allow from others, how you will allow them to treat you. We deserve kindness. We deserve respect and love. But if you have low self-esteem and you don't believe that, then you might be apt to allow people to sort of cross your boundaries or treat you with disrespect, abuse, or mistreatment. And then some of the other barriers could be that you grew up in a family, that parental modeling, where your parents may have modeled sometimes they may have modeled a narcissistic codependent dynamic. Ross Rosenberg talks about it in his book, The Human Magnet Syndrome, how narcissists and codependents are often attracted to each other. And you may have grown up in a family where that sort of dynamic was modeled. And then the parents might have had they may not have modeled healthy boundaries. They might not have had very good boundaries themselves, internal and external boundaries. They may have modeled these very dysfunctional boundaries where either they were violating each other's boundaries through abuse, violence, verbal abuse, psychological, emotional, or they may have had very unhealthy internal boundaries through, addiction or any sort of addiction that was present. That's a lack of good, solid internal boundaries. So it could have been poor parental modeling. You may have had your boundaries violated as a child in an egregious fashion sometimes. Some of the people in these communities, the thrivers and survivors in these communities had some, extreme abuse as children, physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, verbal. You may have had your boundaries so deeply violated as a child that you don't even think that you have the right to have boundaries or to set boundaries. And remember, what boundaries are is they are limits. They are limits for what you will allow, how you allow other people to treat you. Now, with that being said, you cannot change other people. You cannot make them act in any other way than they're acting, but you can have very clear boundaries for yourself and what you will tolerate. And once you set those boundaries, if people continue to violate those boundaries, then you have a choice to exit those relationships so that you no longer allow that person to infringe on your boundaries. Or it doesn't necessarily even need to be exiting the relationship. It could be that you detach, you distance yourself so that you may have sort of a surface relationship with them, an acquaintance relationship, but you don't let them, sort of get in deep and, violate your boundaries, right? So that could be a strategy for you. So other things that can get in the way of, being able to set boundaries are if we have codependence and we have extreme people pleasing, where we're deeply afraid of offending other people or making them mad because we fear abandonment. So that loneliness, that existential loneliness and that fear of being abandoned and left alone may also make it hinder us in our healthy boundary setting. Because if we're afraid that if we set a boundary or we say no or we don't allow somebody to mistreat us, they may exit the relationship, right? And that is actually quite possible. They might. And you have to get to a point where you're willing to set the boundary and be very clear on it and love yourself equally, at least equally to other people. And you set the clear, healthy boundary. And if they need to exit the relationship rather than adhere to your limits of love, then that is quite simply what they need to do. That's up to them. That's not really up to you. But your job is to get in touch with, your core values, with your true feelings, and let your yes mean yes and your no mean no. A couple of other things that may, that may hinder our, ability to sort of set boundaries is, again, that we have this, we're very afraid of people being upset with us. So that extreme sort of people pleasing where we will go to the ends of the earth to try to make somebody else happy. But all the while we're doing that, it's possible that we're saying yes and we're agreeing to things and we're doing things, but internally it's actually a no for us. We're really actually not comfortable with it. And that could go to, enabling behaviors that are very negative, to allowing bullying or, anything like that. It could be many different examples. But if you are so concerned with being nice and people pleasing that you are not willing to tell the truth, which is letting your yes mean yes and your no mean no, then essentially that is a form of dishonesty. I had a wise mentor point out to me, and she said, if you're saying yes, when you really mean no, and you know that it's not a self-honoring behavior, but you're agreeing to something that actually doesn't sit quite right with you, then that is a form of dishonesty. And it's kind of like a codependent dishonesty where it's like this people pleasing. It's like, I'm so afraid to rock the boat. I'm so afraid to have anyone be mad at me, or I'm afraid that I won't be liked, or I'm afraid that, I won't appear to be nice. If you have like a lot of fear around that, then that might also, make it difficult for you to set boundaries. But I'm going to go over a 6-step boundary setting. And I've done this in a few videos, but I feel like repetition is really, really important here. 6 steps to setting boundaries. 1, know what the boundary is. Be very, 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 very clear on what your boundary is. 2, communicate the boundary very clearly to the other person. 3, ask the other person to repeat back to you what you said. So there's no ambiguity, and you make sure that you're both on the same page with what that boundary is, right? Then 4 is you communicate to them what the consequence will be if they violate the boundary. 5, hold the boundary, stay with the boundary. 6, if the boundary is violated, then you follow through and enforce the consequence. And I've talked about this before in other videos, but quite often with codependents, we can even learn, get pretty good at sort of setting boundaries, and we try to communicate them clearly. Where I think we often drop the ball is we don't have the other person repeat back to us what they heard. And you can say, hey, I'm a little awkward at this, but we need to talk about boundaries, and I need to talk to you about one of my limits of love or one of my boundaries, here. And a lot of times we have a hard time with having them repeat it back to us. So you can say, this may be awkward, but can you repeat back to me or let me know what you think I said? So you make sure that you guys are really on the same page and that you have clearly communicated what you're trying to get across and that they clearly understand what you're communicating, right? So a lot of times I feel like with codependents or people that are awkward at setting boundaries, we have a hard time clearly having them repeat back to us what our boundary was, what we just said, right? And then another part that I think people tend to have a really hard time with is number 6, which is actually enforcing the consequence, holding true to what you said. Now, that's why it's very important when you determine what the consequence is that you make sure it's something that you actually are going to follow through with, right? Because if you're not sure, and if it's too extreme, then you're probably not going to follow through with it. So be clear with yourself, not with them, with yourself. What is a consequence that I am willing to enforce? And sometimes it means that when you enforce that consequence, this person is going to exit the relationship, because if they find that they cannot use you or manipulate you, then you might be too difficult for them to want to deal with, and they may not want to have to get respectful and respect your boundaries. And that's possible. And you have to be willing to let those relationships go that are not egalitarian, respectful, loving, and kind. And I'm going to end this video with what boundaries are not. What are things that are not boundaries that we maybe sometimes think are? One is threats that we don't enforce. That is not a boundary. Nagging. That is not a boundary. Walls that don't allow anyone in. That's not a boundary. That's a wall. It's super unhealthy. Limits we set because somebody else told us to. Limits we don't, won't, or can't enforce. Power moves to try and control someone. So if you happen to have some codependence or some, dysfunctional sort of relationship patterns yourself, you might look and see that what you think is setting boundaries is sometimes an actual attempt at controlling another person. And that's something I really had to look at. Where am I trying to control and even manipulate? Codependents can manipulate as well. Where am I manipulating or trying to control another person rather than me controlling me, setting healthy boundaries and enforcing them. So those are some things that are actually not boundaries. So if we're making threats and we don't follow through with them and then we don't enforce them, that's not a boundary. A boundary is actually a lot less about what you say and way more about what you actually do, right? But you have to say it and communicate it, or it's the respectful, decent thing is to communicate it and clearly and state the boundary, and then follow through with it with your actions and your behaviors. So I hope that this is helpful for you. This is all stuff I've had to learn. I'm still learning it. It is not easy to learn. I absolutely have a lot of respect for you guys that are on these channels and you are trying to learn a different way of operating in relationships with other people. So thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.